What if the world order, the one that's kept things relatively stable since World War II, started to unravel, not from some outside threat, but from within? Today, we're jumping into a pretty startling scenario, a geopolitical crisis up in the Arctic where the United States is threatening a fellow NATO member, Denmark, over its autonomous territory, Greenland. But this isn't just a history lesson. We're actually exploring a crisis set in the very near future, 2026, and it's built on tensions that are very, very real right now.
I mean, it sounds crazy, right? Betraying an ally, risking the most powerful military alliance in history, and basically tearing up international law, all for a giant sheet of ice. But as we're about to see, the reasons behind this high-stakes gamble are a wild mix of futuristic military strategy and a good old-fashioned lust for resources. So let's dig in and see how something so unthinkable could actually happen.
All right, let's set the scene. It's 2026, and what started a few years back as a kind of bizarre real estate proposal has now exploded into a full-blown crisis. We're talking about explicit threats that have shoved a stable, 70-year-old alliance right to the edge of a cliff.
Yeah, this is way past the what-if stage. In this scenario, the U.S. is making credible threats, not just of economic pain with tariffs, but of actual military action. And that move, well, it's a direct shot at the #1 rule in the UN playbook. You can't threaten or use force to take another country's territory. It's a fundamental challenge to the way the world is supposed to work.
So you have to ask the question again, why? Why risk all of this? Well, the answer is buried deep under all that ice. Greenland has gone from being a remote Arctic outpost to maybe the single most valuable piece of real estate in the Western Hemisphere, and it's kicking off a modern-day gold rush.
The main driver here is military. The U.S. wants to build something called the Golden Dome, which is basically a next-generation missile shield designed to stop Russian and Chinese hypersonic weapons. But here's the catch. This system only works with total, unrestricted access to Greenland. We're talking about expanding the existing Pituffik space base, scattering sensors all over the ice sheet, and controlling deep-water ports. For the military planners, sovereign control isn't just a nice-to-have, it's a requirement.
And here's a perfect example of what that control gets you. Greenland's location allows you to dominate a crucial naval choke point called the GIUK Gap. That's the stretch of ocean between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK. If you control that corridor, you can effectively trap, get this, 40% of Russia's entire submarine fleet, basically bottling them up before they can even get into the open Atlantic.
But okay, beyond the military stuff, there's just a mind-boggling amount of economic value. It's estimated Greenland is sitting on 1.5 million tons of rare earth minerals. You know, the stuff that's essential for everything from your iPhone to an F-35 fighter jet. Right now, China dominates over 90% of that market, so controlling Greenland's deposits is seen as the key to breaking that economic stranglehold.
And finally, you've got what people are calling the Silk Road on ice. As the polar ice melts, new shipping routes are opening up that are way shorter than the traditional ones. We're talking about routes that can cut the travel time between Asia and Europe by up to 40% compared to going through the Suez Canal. That's a huge deal for global trade. And if you control Greenland, you control the front door to these new commercial superhighways.
So the U.S. has its motives, right? They're powerful ones. But here's the massive roadblock. Greenland isn't just an empty plot of land up for grabs. It's protected by this absolute fortress of international and domestic law that makes a simple sale, let alone a seizure, basically impossible.
At the very heart of this legal fortress is this core principle of self-determination. A law passed in 2009 officially recognized the Greenlandic people as a distinct people under international law. And what that means, in plain English, is that they, and only they, get the final say on their own future. Not Denmark, not the US, nobody else.
And this isn't just one law. It's like a whole series of legal shields stacked on top of each other. You've got an old international court ruling, you've got the UN Charter, but the real kicker is Greenland's own Self-Government Act. It creates what's called a double lock. Any change to Greenland's status requires a referendum in Greenland first. Only if they vote yes can they then negotiate with Denmark. The bottom line is, Denmark literally cannot sell Greenland, even if it wanted to, without the Greenlanders' explicit consent.
And you have to understand this legal fight is also deeply, deeply personal. For the Greenlandic Inuit, this isn't about geopolitics. It is about their history. They have this painful collective memory of 1953, when their ancestors were forcibly relocated, given just days to leave their homes to make way for a U.S. airbase.
So for them, all this talk today isn't some new opportunity. It feels like reopening an old and very deep wound.
But the story gets even crazier. There is another layer to this, a historical twist that is just stunning, and it turns the whole crisis on its head and creates a massive legal problem for the United States itself. I know, it sounds like a trick question, right? What on earth could America's sunny Caribbean territory have to do with its ambitions in the freezing Arctic? Well, the answer is tangled up in a century-old treaty that connects them in a way you would not believe. Okay, check this out. Back in 1916, the U.S. bought what we now call the U.S. Virgin Islands from Denmark. But this wasn't just a simple cash-for-land deal. A crucial, legally binding part of the agreement was something called the Lansing Declaration. In it, the U.S. explicitly promised to respect Denmark's control over all of Greenland. Think about that for a second. The U.S. got the Virgin Islands by promising to leave Greenland alone. So you can see where this is going. By threatening Denmark and going after Greenland, the U.S. is effectively tearing up its side of that 1916 bargain. And according to legal experts, if you break your part of a deal, the whole treaty could be considered void. This action could actually destabilize the very legal foundation of U.S. sovereignty over the Virgin Islands. It's incredible.
And this isn't just some legal theory. It has already sparked a landmark reparations case seeking an absolutely staggering $681 billion. The argument is that if the U.S. just discards its obligations from the 1916 deal, then its claim to the Virgin Islands is invalid. The attempt to gain territory in the Arctic is actively undermining existing U.S. territory in the Caribbean. It's a legal boomerang.
So let's jump back into our 2026 scenario. All of this historical and legal chaos has created immediate and disastrous fallout. The Western Alliance, the bedrock of global security for over 70 years, is fracturing in real time. European allies are not just standing by and watching this happen. In our scenario, they've actually deployed a symbolic multinational force to Greenland, not to fight, but to send a crystal-clear message to back off. The EU has fired back with economic countermeasures, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Danish leaders have stated publicly that a U.S. attack would mean the end of NATO, period. Now, you might hear some people try to argue, hey, this is just another real estate deal, kind of like the Alaska Purchase. But that comparison completely falls apart the second you look at it. The Alaska deal was made with an autocratic Russian empire in an era where indigenous people had no say. Today, Greenland is an autonomous democracy with a legally recognized right to self-determination, and both Greenland and Denmark are flatly refusing to sell. It is a different world with totally different rules.
Ultimately, this whole crisis forces us to confront this deep tension between raw power and the rule of law. The pursuit of Greenland isn't just about territory. It's a test of whether our alliances, our treaties, and the rights of a people to decide their own fate still have any meaning. When you start trying to put a price tag on an ally's home, you risk paying with the very order that has kept the peace for generations. And you have to wonder, what is the true price of that?